All right, so let's jump right in. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into this interview with former President Trump, back in office now after the 2024 election.
Wow.
We also have a fact check of that interview from CNN.
Okay.
It's quite the setup, right? Trump back in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Giving his perspective on everything that's happened.
Right.
I'm curious to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, me too.
And how it all lines up with the facts.
For sure.
So this interview took place on Fox News with Sean Hannity.
Okay.
One of the first things that jumped out at me was how Trump described returning to the White House. He said it felt bigger this time around.
Bigger, huh? That's an interesting choice of words.
Yeah.
Seems to be implying that this second term carries a greater significance than a typical reelection.
Right.
You know, it suggests a sense of vindication, perhaps, after the events of the past 4 years.
Yeah. And he doesn't shy away from assigning blame for those events either.
Oh, really?
He attributes various national and global issues to the policies of the Biden administration.
Like,
specifically mentioning inflation, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the conflict between Israel and Hamas in 2021, and the ongoing war in Ukraine.
So it's like a clear attempt to frame his return as a necessary corrective to what he sees as failures of his predecessor.
Right.
By drawing that direct line between these issues and the Biden administration's policies, he's seeking to establish this narrative of his own competence and the necessity of his leadership.
It's definitely setting a strong tone right from the start.
For sure.
And speaking of setting a tone, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the 2020 election.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, Trump continues to claim that he won both the 2020 and 2024 elections.
Correct.
Claiming a substantial margin in both cases. This, of course, is a continuation of the claims he's been making since 2020.
Right.
He's consistently cast doubt on the legitimacy of the electoral process.
Yeah.
And this interview is no different. He even threw out a specific number for 2020.
Oh, really?
Claiming he won almost 75 million votes.
It's interesting.
Which is interesting because CNN's fact check points out that while the final vote count was historically high for both candidates in 2020, Biden won the popular vote.
Right. So Trump's claim of winning by a substantial margin doesn't quite hold up.
No, it doesn't. And this pattern of making claims that are then contradicted by fact checks is something we see throughout the interview.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about the reliability of his statements.
Right.
And his commitment to factual accuracy.
It makes you wonder about the broader implications of this kind of rhetoric.
Yeah.
If a former president can repeatedly make unsubstantiated claims, what does that say about the state of political discourse?
That's a great question, and I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, especially in an era where misinformation can spread so easily.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another contentious topic, January 6th.
Okay.
In the interview, Trump downplayed the events of that day, calling the assaults on police officers very minor incidents. He also made the claim that the January 6th committee deleted all the information they collected.
Wow. Both of those statements are directly contradicted by the facts.
Yeah.
The January 6th committee released an extensive report detailing the events of that day, including numerous instances of violence against law enforcement.
Right.
And they certainly didn't delete their findings. The report is publicly available and has been widely disseminated.
It's remarkable how he continues to push this narrative, even though it's been debunked so thoroughly.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's not just the committee's findings he disputes. He also brought up the claim that Nancy Pelosi rejected his offer of 10,000 National Guard troops prior to January 6th.
Oh, really?
Citing footage from her daughter as evidence.
That's another claim that CNN directly addresses in their fact check. They explain that the footage Trump references doesn't actually support his assertion. Pelosi has consistently maintained that she never received such an offer. And even if she had, she wouldn't have had the authority to reject it. Control of the D.C. National Guard falls under the president's jurisdiction, not the Speaker of the House.
So it seems like he's trying to rewrite the narrative of January 6th in a way that minimizes his own culpability and shifts blame onto others.
That's a fair assessment. It's a pattern we've seen before, both during his time in office and in the years since.
Yeah.
He often seeks to deflect responsibility and portray himself as a victim of circumstance, even when evidence suggests otherwise.
And speaking of deflecting responsibility, let's turn our attention to immigration. Trump paints a very bleak picture of immigration under the Biden administration, claiming that 21 million migrants have entered the country, many of them criminals. He even repeats the claim that foreign countries, including Venezuela and Congo, have emptied their prisons into the United States.
Again, CNN provides fact checks that directly challenge these claims. The official data on migrant encounters, while substantial, is far lower than the 21 million figure Trump cites. And there's no evidence to support the notion that foreign countries are systematically sending their prisoners to the U.S.
It's a recurring theme throughout the interview. Bold claims followed by fact checks that undermine those claims.
Yeah.
It really highlights the importance of having reliable sources of information and being able to discern fact from fiction.
Absolutely. In an environment where misinformation is so prevalent, it's more crucial than ever to be able to critically evaluate the information we're presented with.
Now, amidst all these criticisms of the Biden administration, Trump does offer some hints about his own agenda.
Okay, like what?
Border security is clearly a top priority. And he also floats the idea of shifting disaster relief away from FEMA and towards a more state-led approach.
That emphasis on states' rights aligns with his previous rhetoric about reducing the role of the federal government. It will be interesting to see how this translates into concrete policy decisions.
It definitely raises questions about the direction he'll take the country in during this second term. Will he double down on the policies of his first administration, or will we see a more moderate approach?
Only time will tell. But this interview has given us a glimpse into his mindset and his priorities.
Yeah.
And it's clear that he's not shying away from the controversial issues that defined his previous time in office.
He's definitely back in the spotlight, and the world is watching.
For sure.
Now, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, there's one more detail from the interview that I found particularly striking.
Okay, what's that?
Towards the end, he makes a comment about the youth vote in 2024, claiming, "I won youth by 36 points.
That's a bold claim, to say the least, especially considering the general trend of younger voters leaning more progressive. It's a claim that CNN also challenges, pointing to exit poll data that indicates Vice President Harris actually won among younger age groups.
Right. So again, we see this pattern of assertions that are contradicted by the evidence.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what his motivation is for making such demonstrably false claims.
It's a question that speaks to the broader issue of truth and accuracy in political discourse.
Yeah.
If a political leader can make blatantly false statements without consequence, what does that say about the health of our democracy?
It's a sobering thought, and one that we'll continue to explore as we delve further into this interview.
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface, and there's much more to unpack. As we dig a little deeper into this interview, I think it becomes even more clear that Trump's language is a key element of his strategy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's not just what he says, but how he says it.
Exactly.
Take, for example, how he refers to his political opponents.
Okay.
It goes beyond simple disagreement.
Right.
It's almost visceral.
Exactly. Remember when he dismissed the Democrats' actions as being driven by either stupidity or hatred for the country?
Yeah.
That's incredibly strong language.
It is. And it's not an isolated incident either. It seems like he's trying to frame them not just as wrong, but as actively dangerous, maybe even treasonous.
Yeah, that kind of rhetoric is a common tactic for silencing dissent and demonizing opposing viewpoints.
Right.
When you paint the other side as inherently evil or unpatriotic, it becomes much easier to dismiss their arguments without actually engaging with them.
It's a disturbing trend, and it's not confined to American politics either.
No, it's not.
We're seeing similar tactics used all over the world.
It's a stark reminder that words have power.
Yeah.
And they can be used to manipulate and incite just as easily as they can be used to inform and enlighten.
There's a moment in the interview that really struck me where Trump was talking about the January 6th Capitol riot.
Okay.
He defended his supporters who stormed the Capitol, claiming that they knew the election was rigged and they were protesting the vote.
That statement is remarkable on a couple of levels.
Yeah.
Not only is he doubling down on his false claims about the election,
right,
he's also attempting to legitimize the violence that took place that day. By framing it as a legitimate protest, he's downplaying the seriousness of the attack and minimizing the responsibility of those involved.
It almost feels like he's trying to rewrite history.
Yeah.
To create an alternate reality where the insurrection was justified.
It's a dangerous game he's playing with real-world consequences.
Right.
When you blur the lines between truth and falsehood,
yeah,
between peaceful protest and violent insurrection, you erode the very foundations of democracy.
Immigration was another major focus of the interview.
Uh-huh.
And Trump recycled many of the same claims he made during his first term.
Like what?
He talked about the border being overrun, threw out some alarming statistics.
He claimed that he believes the number of migrants who have entered the country under President Biden is 21 million. He also repeated the unfounded claim that foreign countries, including Venezuela and Congo, have emptied their prisons into the United States.
Claims which, of course, CNN's fact check directly refutes.
Right.
The actual number of migrant encounters is significantly lower than 21 million.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence whatsoever to support the prison emptying allegation.
It's important to remember that immigration is a complex issue with multiple facets.
Yeah.
There are legitimate concerns about border security and resource allocation.
Right.
But those concerns need to be addressed with factual information and humane policies, not fear-mongering and xenophobia.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, the emotionally charged language.
Yeah.
But we're talking about real people's lives here.
Precisely. Behind the statistics and political debates are individuals with their own stories, hopes, and dreams.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Trump's policy priorities.
Okay.
He didn't go into much detail in the interview,
Uh-huh.
but he did hint at some of his focus areas.
Like what?
Border security is obviously top of the list.
Yeah.
And he also mentioned potential changes to disaster relief, suggesting states should take on a bigger role instead of relying on FEMA.
That emphasis on states' rights is consistent with his previous calls to shrink the federal government. How that will actually play out, though, remains to be seen.
It does make you wonder what direction he'll steer the country in this time around.
For sure.
Will he double down on the policies of his first administration, or could we see a more moderate approach?
Only time will tell. But what's certain is this interview has provided some insight into his thinking and his priorities.
Yeah.
And it's clear he's not backing away from the controversies that marked his first term.
You mentioned earlier the power of language. That's something I want to circle back to.
Yeah, it's a crucial point, especially given the context of this interview.
Trump has a way of using language that stirs up emotions, creates a sense of urgency, even when the facts don't necessarily back him up.
He's a master of hyperbole.
Right.
Of making sweeping generalizations.
Yeah.
Of using emotionally loaded language to connect with his audience on a gut level.
Yeah.
And it's a style that's proven very effective in rallying his base and mobilizing support for his agenda.
But it's also a style that's incredibly divisive and polarizing.
Right.
When you paint your opponents as enemies,
Yeah.
when you exaggerate the threats facing the nation, you create a climate of fear and distrust that can be hard to bridge.
It's a reminder that we need to be discerning consumers of information.
Right.
Not just passively absorbing what we hear, but actively engaging with it.
Yeah.
Questioning assumptions, seeking out different perspectives.
His word choices when discussing immigration are a perfect example. He uses terms like invasion and pouring in to describe migrants arriving at the border.
Those are loaded terms.
Yeah.
Evoking images of a hostile takeover.
Right.
A threat to national security.
Exactly.
They tap into primal fears and make it that much easier to justify harsh and restrictive policies.
Exactly. By framing immigration as a crisis, as an existential threat to the American way of life, he's able to rally support for his agenda, even if the reality on the ground doesn't match the rhetoric.
It's a textbook case of how language can be used to shape public perception and influence policy decisions.
The fact check provided by CNN is invaluable in this context.
Right.
They offer context counterpoints to Trump's claims
Yeah.
and help ground the conversation in verifiable facts.
Organizations like CNN play a vital role in holding those in power accountable and ensuring the public has access to accurate information.
Yeah.
In an age where misinformation and disinformation run rampant, fact-checking is more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. It's so easy to get swept up in the rhetoric, the emotional appeals.
Yeah.
But we need to remember to step back and critically assess what we're consuming.
It's about being discerning consumers of information, not just accepting what we hear or read, but actively questioning it, verifying it, seeking out multiple perspectives.
That's a skill that's becoming increasingly essential in today's world.
Absolutely. We can't simply rely on traditional news sources or social media feeds for information anymore.
Right.
We need to develop those critical thinking skills to navigate this complex information landscape.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of the second part of our deep dive.
In our final part, we'll examine some of the broader themes and implications that emerged from this interview and consider what it all means for the future.
You know, as we wrap up our deep dive into this interview with former President Trump, one theme that keeps coming up for me is this idea of him as a victim.
You're right. You're picking up on a very consistent thread throughout his statements.
Yeah.
He repeatedly casts himself as someone who's been wronged
Yeah.
by the system, by
Yeah.
his political opponents, by the media.
Exactly. We see it in his claims about the 2020 election being rigged, his accusations against the January 6th committee,
Right.
and his portrayal of Democrats as driven by hatred for the country.
It's a narrative that's very carefully crafted to tap into feelings of grievance and resentment among his supporters.
Right.
And by presenting himself as a victim of forces beyond his control, he deflects blame, solidifies his base, and justifies his actions.
This tactic isn't new, of course. We've seen it used throughout history to manipulate public opinion and consolidate power.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that we need to be aware of how language and storytelling can be used to shape our perceptions and influence our beliefs.
One specific area that I found particularly troubling was his stance on transgender policies.
Okay.
He expressed strong opposition to transgender individuals participating in sports and criticized what he called transgender for everyone.
Those comments reflect a broader cultural pushback against transgender rights, often fueled by fear, misinformation, and prejudice.
It's disheartening to hear such blatant transphobia coming from someone who held the highest office in the land.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that transgender individuals are simply striving to live authentically and with dignity.
Right.
They deserve respect and equal treatment, just like everyone else.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to a point we've been emphasizing throughout this deep dive.
Yeah.
The importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
We can't stress this enough. In an era of information overload and rampant misinformation, it's absolutely vital to be able to evaluate sources, identify biases, and separate fact from fiction.
We can't just passively absorb whatever comes across our screens.
Right.
We need to be active participants in the information landscape, questioning assumptions, seeking out diverse viewpoints, and challenging our own beliefs.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into this complex and revealing interview with former President Trump.
It's been fascinating, if somewhat unsettling.
Yeah, for sure.
Exploration of political rhetoric, media manipulation, and the fragility of truth in our digital age.
Absolutely.
So, knowledge is power.
Yes.
But only when it's tempered with critical thinking and a commitment to seeking the truth.
Right.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.